Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is facing all kinds of turmoil, climatological, political, geopolitical, information turmoil. There's a lot of confusion because of the way this young system we call the internet and social media behaves, especially when there's important things happening, whether it's the return of COVID-19 or hurricane approaching a coastline, populous coastline. And this is the Sustain What webcast, which I've been running for almost 4 years since the early days of the pandemic, trying to help people make sense of the information flow, buffeting them and coming away with some useful ideas. Today's episode, I'm Andy Revkin. It's my 40th year in environmental reporting. Pretty much, well, 35 of those years reporting on climate, hurricanes, disaster risk, and the rest. And I've got two great guests here today to check in on a particularly hard hurricane forecast, Hurricane Lee, which has been going now for many days. It's, I think, 3,000 miles it's already covered in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's one of these storms that is slowing down. It's facing some complex atmospheric dynamics as it nears North America. And that makes life hard for people like Jason Nappy, who for News Center Maine and online is a talented young meteorologist, broadcast meteorologist. And it's an interesting arena also for Carrie Mock, who's a professor at South Carolina University, who's a geographer who's studied past hurricane patterns and always in the context of what they mean now, how they relate to what we experience now, and also going forward, how we navigate this kind of risk at the scale of a community, at the scale of FEMA, the big agencies, and the rest. Just want to say a hello to both of you. I'm a little constrained in my technological situation today. I normally have extra screens and stuff, so but I'm in Maine. I'm in Wabanaki territory near the town of Ellsworth, and we live on the coast. Just so you get the context, I'll just show everyone briefly where I am. This is a neighbor's house because our house has been taken over by a visiting film crew of my son is a filmmaker. That is an arm of the sea. There's 10-foot tide range, typically 9-10 feet. And when a storm comes at a high tide, it can create particular havoc. And east of us in Nova Scotia and up Fundy, the Bay of Fundy, as Carrie can explain in a few minutes, I think, the epic tide range there is extraordinary. And at least one storm that Carrie was tweeting about a couple of days ago, the Saxby Gale of October 5th or so, 1869. I think it was the highest tides they've ever measured there or something like that. I was reading back through the history of that devastating storm, which along this coast created terrible problems as well. Anyway, it's great to have you both here. And we have a limited window. So I want to start with Jason. And Jason, could you just sort of tell people who you are, where you work, and then your latest read on this particular system would be great.
Sure, I'll go as quick as possible. There's so much to talk about here. Yeah, I'm born and raised North Jersey. Single mom of three, moved us up here to Southern Maine in 1993 when I was 13. My brother and my sister as well to be a doctor at UNE in Biddeford. So that's the main connection. So I left to go finish school and whatnot after attending Kennebuck Middle School and high school, and I left to go to school in New York and work in New York City behind the scenes at a school in upstate New York and get my tropical stuff down south in Louisiana. Anyway, so I came back here when my mom was diagnosed with cancer about a year or so ago. Chief meteorologist Todd Guttner was gracious enough to make me an offer when they had an opening. Wow. And Todd and I, fun fact, went to the same college, 5 years separated. So what happened is on Sunday night, I put up this video that Andy has up, and I did not expect this video to be what it is, which is, trending number 23 in the world on YouTube. Because I just got up there to try and, as Andy's, alluding to, break down the facts. what I know and what I don't know with the storm, and really pull the curtain back on, as Andy has said, this is, a difficult storm. So talk about the storm specifically here. Um, yeah, the video has got almost 500,000 views. I recorded a video before that, a couple hours before that, that had 200,000, because that's how much the information is changing with this storm.
Right.
This storm went off the coast of Africa like they normally do in late August, the peak of the season, as a cluster of thunderstorms. And what happens is it blew up very quickly, got to a category 5, and none of the models, the computer models we look at, saw the TUT. It's a tropospheric or high altitude wind shear, which tore it apart. So think about a stack of pancakes that are very, compact. And imagine if the top pancakes got knocked off, right? And then you got a wobbly pancake stack. Doesn't look very good, doesn't look very healthy, doesn't look very appetizing. That's what happened. This thing went down to a category 2 out of a 5 very quickly, and the models didn't know what they were talking about. And then it was supposed to get back to a 4, but right now the wind field has expanded so much that, think about it like the stack of pancakes gets kind of high and wide. It can't get any stronger than it is. So it's a category 3. It's probably not going to get to a 4 like was forecasted by the Hurricane Center. And I'm not taking shots at the Hurricane Center. They're a tremendous meteorologist.
Oh, I know.
It's very difficult. There's been a lot of changes. So now the question is scenario 1 or 2 with this storm. For everyone watching in New England and in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, here's scenario 1. The GFS, the American computer model that runs the supercomputers there, that algorithm says this storm is going to hook up with an exiting trough, which I talked about in my videos on Sunday on News Center Maine's YouTube page. And you can go there and check them out. I can link them in chat. So the video I did, where the models were thinking this storm gets picked up by the trough and gets kind of scooped into Nova Scotia, or even at that point, even making it east of Halifax and going out to sea. That was the original thought. And that's scenario 1, which would mean northeast quadrant, either Nova Scotia or Halifax, or everyone misses the storm surge. We all get the waves. We miss the wind. We miss the storm surge. Here's scenario 2, which has been starting to be introduced, especially by the European model, the European supercomputer algorithm, especially last night. When I woke up this morning, I said, whoa, and I tweeted about it, and Andy saw it. The European ensembles take scenario 2, which is a storm that is slower west of Bermuda, where you see it right now on the windy.com, which I love that website and that app. If a slower track storm comes west of Bermuda and it doesn't get scooped up by the trough, if the trough to the north exits and doesn't pick this thing up, even the tail end of it doesn't pick it and put it into Nova Scotia, it goes into Cape Cod, or it goes into maybe the mid-coast or down East Maine, or worst case scenario, it slows down enough from high pressure building in, which I talked about in my almost 500K video. If high pressure comes in and keeps this in the Gulf of Maine, you've got a crawling, slow-moving rainmaker, floodmaker, instead of a fast-moving typical, and probably Carrie could talk about this, a typical New England hurricane, even at Cat 1, is a fast-moving, gets picked up by the jet stream and gets slammed into somewhere, much like Fiona last September, got slammed into Halifax with a pressure that was around 935, one of the lowest pressures ever recorded in Atlantic Canada. Those are typical storms. If this storm takes the slow track, the only good news is the surge will be lower, the wind will be lower, because it will decay rapidly over colder sea surface temperatures. So that's where we're at. Scenario 1 is it goes into Nova Scotia or Halifax, and the worst of the weather for the surge is going to be, a faster storm with the worst wind, but it still won't be like Fiona at all. I want to make that clear. Even the worst case scenario at the faster track. Or scenario 2 is it misses the trough completely, just about, and it gets into either Cape Cod or the Gulf of Maine as a slow-moving rainmaker, floodmaker, versus a a wind one. The wind field will expand, but it will die down. So I can let Kerry talk about the stuff, but that's where we're at. Scenario 1 or 2 to keep it very simple.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I want to get back to the sort of the competing models, because that European center was so far to the west, and you have others that are to the east, and then you have this. You might leave a perception that the middle is most likely, but I think that's one of the things people miss sometimes. The middle is not necessarily more likely just because you have that spread. But Kerry, take us back in time. Tell us a little bit about why and how what is the geography of hurricanes, and how do you wake up in the morning thinking
Let
about
me
this?
say something brief about that scenario 2, then I'll talk about myself some.
Yeah.
Well, scenario 2 is on people's minds. I looked at that latest European run just before I came on, actually, and the latest run actually not quite as west as last night, but similar there. What that tends to show, if someone looks close at some of the different things in there, is when it was mentioned about the troughs pulling it off, you have the long wave pattern. The general long wave pattern is still like a positive tilted trough, a little bit to the west in the European, which doesn't show up in the others. But it has a different timing about when Lee would actually come up north, where the first short wave coming through doesn't actually take it out enough. That's what I think was mentioned, that even the tailwind doesn't bring it out. Then there's a short window where it actually would track a little to the west because it's in between those two short waves coming through. So the other models don't really show that. The GFS a little bit does, but it doesn't have this positive tilted trough. It has a regular trough just kind of centered to the south. So the European's weird on that, but it had that twice in a row now. I thought maybe the afternoon one, it could merge more to the GFS, but I guess we just have to see in the next run if that's the case. But I wouldn't leave that western track out of the realm, though.
Yeah, I know. And believe me, given where I live, this is of great interest to me, and certainly a lot of Mainers. And actually, before we get into your history stuff, maybe a little bit more on this question of when you have, I remember from many winter storms and nor'easters and the like, there's always this, you see the WX Twitter debating, European, the sort of skill of the European model versus the GFS and the others. Do you each internally have your own sense of which you feel does better with certain kinds of storms, or is that even a good question to ask? Maybe back to Jason and then Kerry.
Yeah, I mean, over the years, there's been some, kind of back and forth about, all right, well, this, okay, so the European model doesn't go out as far as the GFS, so it doesn't get into, we call it happy hour territory as often as the GFS. For example, the 384-hour GFS, if anyone looks at that and says, oh, that's like trying to tell someone what they're going to have for dinner in 3 weeks. Like there's too many variables, like how much money do you have, where you are, if there's a place closed down, whatever. So that's why the GFS gets a bad rap. However, sometimes the GFS also, doesn't know what it's doing either. I look at both as a guide. Computer models are a guide. Your experience should supersede what the models are saying. The climatology, you have to be able to look at these models and say, well, this one skews one way or another. There's bias, in each one. So none of them are foolproof. For example, the hurricane models did really well with Hurricane Franklin a few weeks ago. The short range, the new HAFS did really well with Franklin. And Idalia, especially. Yeah. It did. The new hurricane models, the HFS, that has been terrible with this storm, with Lee. So this is why you can't ever use models as gospel. And this is why deterministic runs or operational runs, you really have to throw them out until you have an ensemble consensus. And that's what you're looking for here. And right now there is not a battle, but you can call it that. I know, my coworker Keith, is well known up here, likes to do the battle, and you can call it that, but really they're not battling. They're fighting with each other, right? They're not going up against against individual models. So that's why we look for some consistency. And when I talked about in the video that got all those hits is there are clusters in the ensembles. So you never look at one deterministic or operational run. You look at the clusters in the ensembles. It's what I've always been taught by my mentors. And look at those clusters to get an idea of where the trend is going based on what Carrie was talking about. Is there a short wave coming through? You got to look at the overall pattern before you can ever look at a deterministic run.
Right. And Carrie, again, what's your sense of how the average person should look at the TV screen or their phone when they're seeing
most
these?
meteorologists, I would agree, the models are a guide. Generally, the GFS and the European are the two leads, and they're good leads. The thing about them is they tweak the models every year, and they improve them all the time. So it's hard to say one's a certain bias over the other, because they change over time. The GFS used to get a little bad rap last year for too much bias over convection. It seems like they try to fix that a little bit. The European, from what I've seen this year, for example, generally has underestimated the intensity. And those, the HAFS model was mentioned, it's new. Those nested models are kind of new. They're supposed to be good at the rapid intensification. They're usually going to have a hurricane on steroids type of thing in there. So I would be wary of those, some of those explosive rapid intensification and made those things look good. And they're a feature, but those hurricane models, you should kind of look at them cautiously on the intensity. They're based on the GFS input too. So they're not completely independent.
The thing that I've been writing about this kind of thing for 20 years. The earliest storm I really dug in on was Hurricane Ivan in the Gulf, approaching Alabama. I was at the National Hurricane Center in 2004 while they were running their calculations. And back then they had colored pencils and erasers and a chart. It didn't look like this. There were already supercomputers behind the scenes, but it was really something. But the question for people on the shore, whether they're here in, my neighbors in Eastport, which got hit in 1869, or in Bar Harbor or wherever, is, how soon, what do you do? And to me, even if this is a miss, even if it does end up being a hit, sadly for Nova Scotia, it allows you to at least run the drill. It allows you at least to sort of take stock. Do you have a go bag? Is your garage door waterproofed? And I rather than worrying so much about waiting for clarity, I don't know if that feels sensible, or is that part of the Jason, when you talk to either a neighbor or when you're in your shows, how you deal with that?
Yeah, well, Andy, I mean, like with this video that you have up, we're human communicators. Broadcast meteorology is about communication. It's about taking complex things and making it understandable and relatable, and not being condescending. And you don't want to turn people off when you're talking to them. You want to explain what could happen. Something like when I got to do that video, there's so much information in my mind that I had to get out in a very clear, concise way. I related it to pizza. I related it to, to ice cream, to who I am, but also explaining that there's a lot here I don't know, but there is stuff that I do know. Right. And what I do know is there are big factors here, like the sea surface temperature, okay, like classic New England storms. And this one's not going to be like Fiona last year. It's not going to be like some of like Bob was in 91 that hit Rhode Island and then brought, devastating impacts to Maine. Okay. It's not going to, that I know, right? And there's a lot of misinformation as you open this, you did your monologue, misinformation on the internet, because people see scary images and they don't give context to what those are. Like you could show 850, a wind field that looks like the end of the world's coming. But what people don't mention, social meteorologists and whoever, is the number one factor with this storm is going to be if it slows down and it gets cut off from that Gulf Stream, which it's going to. It's not a classic New England hurricane or Nova Scotia hurricane, Atlantic Canada. Right. That cold sea surface temperature is going to take this wind field, and even though it's going to be wide, it is going to take the intensity like air out of a balloon, and it is not going to, unless it picks up incredible forward speed, this storm, which doesn't look like that's in the cards, even for the GFS. It's not going to be incredible forward speed. It's not going to be coming in at a pressure of 935 millibars like Fiona, right? That's not going to happen. So this storm is a good, like you said, dry run, a good drill for things, because it doesn't have the potential that Fiona did. It doesn't have the forward speed. It doesn't have the rapid intensification.
Right.
It's going to be sitting over probably cold waters for long enough for the wind intensity to go down, the wind field. There are a lot of pros to both scenarios for us here in Maine, and also, Cape Cod and for Nova Scotia with this. So this is not going to be one of those storms that comes in as it's increasing in intensity and rapidly intensifying and doesn't have time to sit over cold water. That's not going to happen with this one.
That's good. So I do want to get to the history question. So Carrie, back to your work, looking back in time, tell everyone about hurricane history and geography and how that relates to what people experience now and ahead.
Okay, well, I'll put it more in the context of Maine to begin with.
Sure.
So Maine, because of its unique shape of the coastline and all that, just rarely gets hit. At least, they occasionally they get up there, but they usually kind of die out. And I think Lee will maybe even become one of those typical ones. And it won't be at hurricane strength, and it's spent a lot of time over colder waters since what's that one, Franklin and Idalia. It's actually going over their wakes where, they upwelled some colder water. So that's why the sea surface temperatures are colder. So, the main threat of Lee, I think, will be its potential size and the tides. But, you never know with some of the jet stream energy, it could create some gusty winds. But not as big as some of those in the past. But there have been some in the past. That's where the hurricane history comes in. Or you get some of those so-called unprecedented events you don't see just in the modern record. And for Maine, for like a real hurricane, you have to go back a long time. Like I think it's 1969 Gerda. I think that was a bare category 1, but it was a legit category 1. And then 1954 Edna, about 85-mile-per-hour storm. It devastated actually Cape Cod earlier, as well as a stronger storm, a category 2. And then the Saxby gale of 1869. I think it was a non-tropical, a post-tropical, but it was a weird storm. That's why these older storms, sometimes you get these weird circumstances where that potentially could have been post-tropical, really not a tropical characteristic. But if you look at all the older newspapers and reports and all that, overnight there, they had category 2 level damage. So
for sure,
very unusual storm. And as mentioned, the Bay of Fundy, I think they had like record tides, maybe up to 70 feet or something like that. Kind of really unthinkable.
You had posted this clipping. Do you find this through like newspapers.com, or how did you, or had you already had this somewhere in a file?
Yeah, well, I used to do a lot more New England hurricane history back around 2004, 2005. And back then, actually, I had to do more at the archives. So I did a lot of stuff at the Boston Public Library and places like that. Now they have, I would say, about 70% of them, not all of them online, although you got to pay for them. So things like newspapers.com, the state library stuff and things like that. But some of the NOAA archives and all that have actual instrumental records. And there's some private weather enthusiasts like the Saxby gale. There were people like over in Cape Cod taking pressure measurements. And there was a Augusta, Maine pressure value of 972 millibars or something like that.
Yeah, and I see News Center Maine had a story. I'm going to see if I can put that on the screen in a second. I'm having some issues on my computer because I have an ad blocker that I can't get rid of, and it seems to.
The one thing that's a little bit of a note, I think the
Yeah.
Maine hurricanes that make it, they're a little bit different than, say, the southern New England type hurricanes. Because when you look at Gerda, the tracks of Gerda, Edna, and the Saxby gale, they all travel mostly along the Gulf Stream, right near the coasts. So that's different from Lee, which was a little bit farther out to sea, where the others probably could have benefited more directly from the warmer SSTs of the Gulf Stream.
So interesting. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this so people don't have to squint. Awful news from eastern Maine. Appalling effects of Monday's hurricane. This is the October 5th, 6th storm of 1869. Appalling effects of Monday's hurricane throughout Washington County. Eastport in ruins, wharves and vessels wrecked, hundreds of barns and other buildings blown down, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of property gone. That's $1869. and it goes on, quite extraordinary. And this gets to this bigger point I find valuable, whether you're in Florida or Rhode Island or Maine, or Madagascar for that matter, that understanding, finding ways to identify these past patterns, sometimes through records in a library, but often through digging cores behind beaches like Jeff Donnelly at Woods Hole and others do, gives you that bigger picture. The only way to understand the patterns of rare events is to look at a long time scale. And so I think that's why people like you and Jeff Donnelly and Joanne Muller down in the west coast of Florida are doing really valuable work. Again, probing these documents. And again, there's a media habit these days of immediately thinking, oh my God, Hurricane Michael in Florida was unprecedented, or this is climate change. You know, I've been writing about climate change for 35 years, and not everything is about climate change. And some of these patterns are more about deep cycles of extreme events that are only marginally well understood. So it's great that sorry.
There is some evidence in the climate change, just to be pro-climate change a little bit, is the fact that there is some evidence that some of these stronger hurricanes we're getting more category 4 and 5s, or possibly
Right.
more of that rapid intensification. And possibly in the recent decade or so, things like the Hurricane Harveys, there's more rainier storms. You know, although we still have
Right.
to examine that more, but the climate change thing is there, but it's hard to just pick one event one day and say for sure that's due to climate change, like a tornado happening or something like that.
Right. Now, I know we're getting near the end of your day, Carrie. If you have to sign off, maybe one last thought from you again for people in the audience now or later, viewing this later. You know, again, through the next few days on this storm, or generally, what's the advice you give to people when they're looking at a screen? They might be in harm's way, or they might be apt to share something or be cautious about it. What do you say?
Generally be prepared. Like you mentioned, it's a pretty good dry run at the very worst, and something will happen. So you're not preparing for nothing. So those really obviously in the real low-lying areas in particular should pay attention to the tides and what the local emergency managers say and things like that. But, you know, as mentioned, it's not going to be a Fiona. I think over in Nova Scotia in the eastern part, they've gotten some bigger, fiercer ones. Like I said, Maine is kind of lucky most of the time. It's pretty unusual and things like that. But out over, you know, the way it looks like right now, you know, Nova Scotia probably has to be a little bit more serious about expanding wind field and higher tides and things like that. But it could be potentially be a pretty good rainmaker. But I assume you guys are kind of used to that in Maine a little bit.
Oh my God, this year particularly, we've had too much rain. Wouldn't you say, Jason?
Yeah, last year we had a severe drought. This year we have severe, flooding. So it completely pendulums went the complete opposite direction.
Yeah, and then just last word for you, Jason. Again, I don't know if you're going to be on air later tonight or this week. There's more than one meteorologist there at News Center, Maine, right? So what's your takeaway, and where should people go?
Yeah, we've got 5 full-time and then one pretty consistent freelancer. So I would imagine Keith and Todd will get most of the airtime this week, with a potential, storm coming. So I'll kind of be behind the scenes, maybe doing things like the video I did, that kind of stuff, explainers or whatnot, I think in blogs. And then, on Saturday when the storm is on our doorstep, then I'll, most likely be on air in some capacity. And then Sunday next week, by the way, just a little heads up, it's going to be beautiful once a big high comes in that is going to, get in here and clear things out. We'll actually get probably the nicest weather we've had all technically sort of summer at that point, almost over, by the calendar. But as far as the storm goes, I'm just looking at the two scenarios right now. Does this thing get picked up by the trough or not? Does the GFS and Euro come together in the middle? Do they meet in the middle? Does it really get into Maine at all? I don't think there's going to be a landfall in Maine. I think the greatest threat from the storm is going to be a few hour or so Saturday late flood threat if we get the slower solution for southern Maine, especially, in the coast. Tides, no king tides with this, probably not a high tide situation. I don't think we're going to get a surge. I think flooding, because that is where we're at. Now, if the storm takes the faster track, gets to Nova Scotia, you've got leaves on trees, you got that friction. You've probably got more wind with a faster track. So I could see Nova Scotia getting the worst of it if it's talking about wind and surge. But there's no wild card with this one. It's not going to get, I don't think the models are going to miss this enough to put it into a Fiona category. I think there's no shot of that.
Yeah. This is, by the way, this is the GFS model projection as shown on windy.com for Saturday. And there, you're right into Yarmouth. But they know how to batten down there too, right? Yeah. That's an area that definitely
they're exposed. See, the thing about southern Maine, especially, and even the mid-coast, is that we're protected by southern New England. We're protected by Cape Cod. So that's why we don't, climatologically speaking, get landfalling storms here in southern Maine where I am. I'm in Kennebunkport. That's why the down east is exposed. That's why from, mid-coast, Rockland north up to, Bar Harbor and Eastport, they're exposed. But we don't get that stuff here because Cape Cod is our kind of deflector shield.
Yeah, interesting.
It seems like in the past, if you say there's a hurricane capital in Maine, which is not a real big hurricane capital, it will be Eastport. They have probably the most written histories.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was the core of that Saxby storm. Now the European model is still again. This was the 0 Zulu time. This is the European model for the storm. It seems to be slower in the European model, and it does show. That's that western track. They show it coming right through my backyard, basically right there, Sunday. And I guess we'll see. Again, if you're in anywhere, if you're on a coast or in an inland area that's subject to inland flooding and the like, battening down hatches, making sure you're as prepared as possible, knowing your egress route if you need to get away if the worst happens, and staying tuned to people like Jason Nappy or whoever his equivalent is in your neighborhood, Jeff Berardelli down in Tampa, and the others who've been on my show. So thank you both for spending some time here today. It was a very abrupt invitation. And this shows to me the value still of the thing now called X, which is Twitter to me still. It's an important place for people, again, in real time when storms are brewing or other events are unfolding. There's nothing quite like it still, despite other assertions. This is Andy Revkin, again, 40 years on the Environment and Climate Beat. Sustain What? If you have some questions to forward to both of the guests today, you can see in the scrolling bar at the bottom how to get in touch with me, and I'll forward them and we can do some more Q&A. And go forward with your evenings and your weeks, and stay tuned. Subscribe to Sustain What? That's my project. And there's information all around here on the screen on how to do that. Take care, both of you. And thanks for your time.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.